Okay, let's take a look at using some of these modern techniques we've talked about in other videos. Um, you'll see me sort of attempt to demonstrate some of these in Finale as we go along. Again, I think sort of an easy way to start writing something that sounds modern is by creating some type of vamp or repeated section at the beginning of a song. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and put in a repeat sign because I know whatever phrase I'm going to come up with is likely going to be repetitive. And then I might sort of repeat it over and over and over again. You know, one of the ideas that I suggested as sort of an easy means of writing a vamp is coming up with a figure that alternates being on and off the beat. So I think in this case, the phrase that I'm going to choose is going to be on the and of 1, on beat 3, and then on the and of 4. Again, it doesn't have to be super complicated because the idea is that as we sort of develop it, we're going to fill in some of the space and create sort of an interesting figure. You'll notice I'm starting with the bass in this case because I think I'm going to build upwards sort of from that particular point. So in this case, I think I'm going to do something that stays around E flat major. Again, this is sort of working under the guidance that I'm working on an arrangement of There Will Never Be Another You, which is in the key of E flat major. I think in this case my key signature might be wrong because I think in previous examples I demonstrated that potentially moving it into a different key might lay better on certain instruments. But for our purposes, we're just going to keep the key signature as it is. But we're going to work on this arrangement, like I said, in the key as though it was an E flat major. Again, sort of a cool effect too would be to have the melody in A flat major, but to use E flat as sort of the tonic or a pedal point. So in theory, we could potentially keep it here and do some relatively interesting things as well. In this case, I wrote a 2-bar phrase that we're going to repeat several times over and over and over again. Again, at this stage, the only thing that we're missing is just trying to determine which direction we want to move with the harmony. Remember, one of the ideas I gave you is to have some sort of central landing point for the harmony, either that we arrive to or something that we leave from. So in this case, because I know I want to go to E flat major, I'm going to choose that as sort of the chord for the last hit in this little vamp idea. In this case, I think I'm going to pick something simple, and I'm just going to go up a half step. So we're going to have basically 3 beats of E major, and then we're going to hit the E flat major on the and of 4. I think this will provide a nice little tension. And again, this particular step can be relatively simple because as we orchestrate it out and then write a bass line, and or maybe eventually down the line write some type of counterlines to it, that's sort of where the complexity will fall into place. If this part of it is too complex, it sort of limits what might sound effective later on. So in this case, you'll notice I've put the hit in the drums as well as in the rhythm section parts, with the idea that now we can just copy that over into the other parts, into the other repeated sections, and sort of develop it onwards from there. I think this would now be a great place for us to stop and for you to take a minute and go ahead and write a vamp and fill it in the rhythm section parts. Okay, as we continue on, so now that you have sort of the basic shell of your vamp written out, now it's time to orchestrate it in one of the horn sections. Again, I would pick one collection of instruments. It could be the saxophones, could be the trumpets, could be the trombones, and actually sort of flesh out a voicing for your vamp figure. Again, this is especially effective once the vamp's already been established by the rhythm section, and it builds it's sort of a nice development of the piece by then having the next repeat have one of the sections sort of join in doing this. In this case, I'm going to choose to have the saxophones join in, and for our purposes, again, because it's sort of a vamp figure and there might be something else happening over the top of it. Could be a soloist, could be the drums filling, could be maybe some other pads happening from somewhere else. I'm actually just going to voice this up from the baritone saxophone with a nice spread voicing. So you notice that as I write this figure in initially, making sure that I include articulation as well as a dynamic level, because my intention is then to cut copy this phrase into each of the remaining saxophone parts and then transpose it to where it needs to be in the chord. So of course, as I mentioned, I'm doing a spread voicing with this. So I have the root and the berry. Then I'm going to copy it up, and I'll probably have the third in tenor 2. So I will go ahead and just transpose this up a third. I'll have to make some enharmonic adjustments to make it a little more readable. I think on its initial transposition it gives us some G sharps, but A flat is already in a key signature. Then I'm going to transpose the tenor 1 part up 5th. So we have the 7th of the chord. So now we have root 3, 7. We'll need the 9th in alto 2 and the 5th in alto 1. Again, I'm doing this mostly for the effecting because it's just a nice voicing that works well with saxophones. If I had something more melodic in mind, I would probably start with the alto 1 part and then write downwards. But for our purposes, I think, again, this is a very sort of easy way to get started with this idea of vamp writing. As I mentioned, when I use this approach and the transposition approach, I have to go through and make a few adjustments enharmonically to make sure that things are spelled correctly. In the case of the tenor 1 part, I also think the 7ths were not correct. We wanted all major 7ths on that. So you see, again, this requires a little bit of creativity on the behalf of the composer, and you have to sort of imagine what else might be happening in here, because you won't always be able to notate everything. You know, vamps are great opportunities to have people solo on top of them, so you can imagine maybe whoever the featured soloist might be blowing on top of this. Now that we've sort of orchestrated this out in one setting, for the next repeat, I'm going to go do the same thing again, but this time I'll just write it out for the brass. So I do like that spread voicing, especially with the trombones. I think that puts the trombones typically in a very sort of good place. So I'm actually going to copy the entire voicing down and have the alto 1 part be what would be trumpet 4. And so then we can craft sort of our own unique voicing for the trumpets, but we'll use that spread voicing as sort of the underbelly for the entire brass section. One of the approaches to brass writing that I like a lot is the idea that we'll have some type of chordal voicing in the trumpets. So in this case, we're going to have the 1st and 4th trumpets playing the same notes, but just an octave apart. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that up. And then when I'm filling in the inner trumpet parts, I really want to think about what might be some interesting sounds. So in this case, I'm going to put trumpet 2 down a 4th, and they'll basically be playing the same as trombone 1 up an octave. So we'll put that F sharp to F up there. They're playing the 9ths. And then, again, because I want this sort of chordal sound, I'm actually going to put trumpet 3 a whole step down from trumpet 2. So they'll be actually playing the roots, which will be sort of hidden up there and obscured by this sort of 4th sound that we'll have working in the trumpets. So again, this is sort of a using both a combination of like spread voicings and chordal voicings in the brass to create a nice little orchestration of this vamp rhythm. At this juncture, I would say you should go and do the same thing. Pick out a horn section and go ahead and orchestrate your vamp. Okay, so now hopefully you've orchestrated your own little vamp here. The next phase, and again, this is sort of where you can begin to get even more creative, is maybe you want to develop some type of counterline or bassline that goes along with the vamp. In this case, I'm choosing to sort of alter the bass pattern a little bit to come up with something that works with the rhythm. You know, as you're depending on how your particular rhythm falls in the bar, it might be something that hits with the vamp line. In other cases, maybe it's something that complements it, or maybe something that fills in the space. In this case, because we're starting on the and of 1, I think the best alternative right now is to have something that sort of gives us beat 1 and beat 2, and then a little phrase on beats 3 and 4 that leads us to the and of 4. Again, this is sort of to provide some contrast and some stability with the rhythm, so that it doesn't feel too jumpy, and it feels like the vamp rhythm is playing off of this sort of new bass line. Again, as you sort of initially create your bass line, I would think very simple, working with roots and fifths as sort of target notes. Again, with the idea that this particular line is sort of filling in for everything else that's, this is going to be one of the things that's most interesting, but it's also sort of being very stable and giving us the chord tones and sort of the foundation of the chord. Again, if you check out the notes that I'm doing here, you see again it's pretty simple. I'm also adding in a little phrase at the end of the second bar, the and of 2 beats 3 and 4, to work as sort of a lead-in for the next phrase. Because this is a little more melodic and I'm going to be copying it in some of the horn parts, I'm going to add in some articulation. Anytime you write anything that has quarter notes in it, it's always a good idea to have articulation so that the horns know whether it's supposed to be long or short or accented. So I just want to make sure that all of that is very clear before I copy it away. One of the sort of common practices of writing a bass line like this is that it's utilized in all the lower instruments, and we could see it happen in trombone 4 or bass trombone. We could see it happen in the baritone saxophone. In some cases, it could happen in trombone 3 as well, or trombone 5 if you have writing for a bigger trombone section. It's possible you could see it sort of happen all over the place. Furthermore, if you're writing a sort of a very developed chart and you like this counterline, this is something that could be utilized later as melodic material as part of an ensemble shout section or something else. So it gives you more melodic material from which you can pull later on. Finally, sort of the last step here that I'm doing as part of sort of developing this vamp is I know I want this in some way to sort of set up the melody. So I'm going to write the vamp one more time outside of the melody, but this time orchestrated for all the horns and utilizing the bass line in all those voices, because I think sort of the final step for this then of course is how we decide to bridge this to the melody. In some cases you can have the melody happen on top of the vamp. In other cases you could just go into the melody as normal and sort of providing a contrast from what's come before. In the next section of this, we'll get into this, but I think right now probably the best idea is for you to go ahead and pause the video again and either write a bass line or write some type of counter line that some of the horns play that works with the vamp and helps sort of develop some of the ideas that we've already been working on. Okay, finally, for the last stage of this little exercise, again, remember what we want to do with the vamp is we want this to either be contrasting material and then have the melody come in as normal, or we're using this to sort of set up a specific environment that the melody will happen on top of. One example I gave of this is Maria Schneider's great arrangement of Days of Wine and Roses, where this sort of vamp pedal idea is established in the beginning, and then the melody sort of happens organically over it. In the case of this example, I think what we're going to try is I'm going to give one more hit on the and of 4 that sort of brings the band together, and then I was going to write a few different examples of the melody happening just over the vamp in its most simple fashion, without a counter line and without being orchestrated in the horns. If you decide to write some type of ending figure before leading into the melody, make sure that this figure either sounds conclusive or that it's full of sort of melodic tension, or harmonic tension, I should say, so that the listener's ears are prepared for the melody that's going to happen next. In this case, I think I'm planning on just writing this hit on the end of 4 as a big B flat 7, flat 9, sharp 11 chord. Again, just to create a little bit of tension before we go back to sort of E flat land, especially given that the melody is going to be happening just over this vamp and not over the sort of original set of chord changes. Again, I've also found that if you're able to go and add dynamics and or articulation as you go, it will save you significant time on the back end trying to go back and add these things in my head, I think I already have a pretty clear idea of what I want this chord to sound like and how I want it to be attacked. So I'm just going ahead and adding in this forte piano before I'll begin actually writing the melody. As I'm finishing sort of filling in all this, I want to go ahead and set up a few of the ideas that we'll be utilizing next. First, remember, it's of course very important to include double bar lines and rehearsal marks to keep your thoughts organized and to keep sort of a clear visual on what's happening with regards to the form. So as I started thinking about the melody and what's going to happen next, I thought this would be a good time to explore some of the possibilities one could look at when it comes to some different techniques we have for melodic development, especially when it comes to melodic extension. You know, one sort of very fascinating way to look at adapting a particular melody is to change the rate of the melody so that it's either faster or slower than originally intended. Since we're using a vamp to go ahead and disrupt the harmony, now is a perfect time to either slow down or speed up a melody, using a different rate. Of course, the easiest ways of doing this are just by adapting a melody note that's typically quarter notes and changing those quarter notes so that they're all half notes. Right? This would potentially dramatically slow down how a melody sounds, but you could make the tempo significantly faster underneath it and have sort of a cool effect. Another possibility is you go the opposite direction when it comes to talking about rhythmic rates, and you make a melody that's all quarter notes into all eighth notes. Now, if you had a very slow tempo with the rhythm section playing time, the melody would still actually sound somewhat fast because the rhythmic rate is much quicker because now they're working as eighth notes. Once I get sort of all the rhythm section parts here squared away, what I will do is I'm going to, just in the tenor one line, write out the melody again so you can again see how the first few bars of There'll Never Be Another You looks. I chose it in large part because it is mostly quarter notes and very easy to follow. I'm still getting articulation and adapting the little bass line here for that hit on the end of 4. I should say too that if you're able to go through and add in all this rhythm section information as you go, or again as I encouraged even before you write in everything, you'll find that it just saves you significant time on the back end trying to go in and fill in the blanks. I think if you're able just to get this information in there, and if you have to change or tweak things later, that's okay. But I do think you'll save yourself a lot of time. I think one thing I'm realizing now I forgot to do in this video is I need to change that E flat major to a B flat 7, flat 9, sharp 11. As I mentioned too, when I sort of copy the vamp figure over again to be used with the melody over it, I'm very interested in keeping this in sort of its simplest form. I'm not so interested in having the counterline happen yet. I want to save that material again for later on. A lot of times the purpose of the counterline, as well as the orchestration, is just to sort of help develop an intro with something that sounds more modern, but I don't want it to sort of get in the way of the melody. I sort of want to have everything open up so that way I can sort of reuse those textures later on. All right, so now I'm finally at the stage here where I'm copying the melody in. And again, you'll notice the melody to There'll Never Be Another You is very simple. And it's a lot of quarter notes. Because I still want the melody to sound energetic and I want the rhythm section to be playing somewhat fast underneath it, I'm going to make sure that if I extend the melody, that I'm going to be using rates that are of longer duration than quarter notes. All right, again, I sort of want the tempo on the more bright side. If you were working with something and you wanted a ballad tempo, you might make the rhythmic rates smaller, so you turn those quarter notes into eighth notes. In this case, I'll show you a few different ideas that sort of resolve differently. I'm going to write those ideas initially here in the tenor 2 part. So this first time, one potential adaptation for this that's pretty fascinating is if you turn every quarter note into a dotted quarter. Right? This will give us a lot of feelings of, there's a lot of on and off beat ideas, as well as this idea of sort of 3 against 4. That can be pretty effective. Now, because I'm just trying to demonstrate this, I'm writing all of the examples or all of the rhythmic phrases with this idea. But as you go through and play it and sort of take in what your ears take, it might be that you don't need every single quarter note to be a dotted quarter. These are all parts of sort of the editing process where you really want to make your chart sound as good as possible. It is not necessary, when you're applying this rhythmic rate thing, to have every single rhythmic duration be changed, especially if it doesn't sound great. But they can be very effective in sort of breaking things up. So you'll notice that by doing this, I've now stretched what was normally a 3-bar phrase into a 4-bar phrase. All right. Again, if you were to go through and play this and listen to it, you'd hear there's lots of rhythmic tension. Now, again, another idea we could explore is just doing every 1 beat now equals 2 beats. So in this case, turning every quarter note into a half note. And you'll sort of see what this looks like. This can, again, be effective, maybe even more so than the other idea, because our sort of rhythmic energy is being pulled from this vamp idea. That we already have phrases happening on and off the beat down there, that the melody now can sort of respond to this. Also, if you want to write something that's a little more conducive to having musicians ad-lib over, a phrase like this is definitely much more ad-libbable, because they might sort of push and pull rhythm as they see fit, as opposed to something that has to be exact, like the dotted quarter notes. One other quick change I just added in there that I sort of like is, instead of having the last beat of the dotted quarter variation hit on beat 1, it's like the vamp figure itself hits on the and of 4, so you might as well like tie that together, and that works as sort of a nice little punctuation rhythmically for the phrase. So it's like the very last one, everybody sort of hits together. Again, now that you sort of have this sort of clear blueprint for one way of sort of extending the melody, another idea you could explore is having something that's not exact. So in this case, every other beat I'm doing a dotted quarter, and then the other beats I'm doing a long note worth 5/8 notes, or 2.5 beats. Again, this idea is sort of interesting. I don't love it working with the vamp, because you'll notice this in this case the melody is beats 1 and the and of 2, and the vamp is the and of 1 and 3. So there might be sort of a lot of arguing or hiccuping between those two phrases that I don't think always works particularly well, but it's something sort of worth exploring. All right. Again, I would only use one of these ideas before sort of moving onwards. Hopefully that's a helpful demonstration of some of these techniques we're using in person. I definitely encourage you just to start writing and be creative.